Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch.
Hello and welcome back to Poddenham Podspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts. I'm your host, Ian, here to talk about podcasts, Spurs podcasts, that is. And yeah, it's been a while since I've chatted to you guys. I decided to hold off on recording anything after Frank was fired because that was such a fast-moving situation with the Newcastle loss and Frank getting shit-canned and rumours of who might come in, and then Tudor came in, and then it was the pre-North London derby, and I can't move quick enough. I can't listen to podcasts quickly enough to turn around something of a reasonable standard. So yeah, I thought, why not pump the brakes a little bit, slow down a little bit, take in a little bit more for a sort of broader landscape around Igor Tudor, whatever you want to say. I've heard it all. Like his period of time with Spurs, right? And it does feel pretty good overall, I think. Speaking as a long-suffering Spurs fan, not only is the weather outside here in beautiful Rockville, Maryland, warming up a little bit, we're getting rid of the snow, the cold, and we're starting to get like the nights pushing back a little bit more sun in the evenings. Like it is starting to get nicer at the start of March coming around the corner. And with that, let me try and actually loop this back to Spurs somehow for you. And with that, we've shaken off the cold of Frank, and we're welcoming in the nice, beautiful spring of Igor Tudor, bringing with him, chocolate eggs and happiness. So yeah, I think that it would be nice to sort of go back and listen, or talk about rather. I think it'd be good to go back and talk about how the Spurs fan base and particularly podcasters have reacted to all of this change in the last 2 weeks, and just how much of an influence the North London derby had on sort of welcoming Tudor, and also whether or not the good graces that might have been offered to him were persistent. So I'm going to go through Frank's sacking a little bit, not much. Tudor's hiring, North London derby vibes before and after the game. Before I get started, got to do the social media marketing crap and all the other stuff. Had a lovely time with people in my Spotify comments recently, dropping some remarks, talking about how brilliant I am, love all that, and just having a bit of back and forth with them. So like, if you like what you're hearing, you're on Spotify, drop me a comment. I always try to respond in some way. Likes, shares are always welcome. Always looking to like grow this. And you know what? If you're a podcaster out there and you want me on, I'll come on and have a nice little chat about Spurs with you. So, God, this is a bit of a weird pod today. Thomas Frank. I think it's safe to say that by the end, 90% of Spurs fans were done, right? The stats had fallen off a cliff. The performances were also, in my opinion, dropping off. The vibes were awful across the podcast and across social media. I can't talk about the stadium itself, but based upon the booing, which is pretty much unprecedented in my time as a Spurs fan to hear as much booing consistently as we did. It really was far too late, was just the general consensus. I think I talked in my last pod about people remarking on when he should have gone, and for some people it was after the Chelsea game, some people it was after the Arsenal game, West Ham, maybe it should have been before January, but like all of these are at least a month before we actually got rid of him. So just there was this real dereliction of duty from the leadership group at Spurs in actually making meaningful changes. And now we're in a situation where we have like 3 months left, and God knows if it's enough. I mean, we all hope it's enough. We all hope the squad, as players come back and hopefully don't get, shot in the leg or something, can come back and make a meaningful difference to our, relegation fight. But we'll have to see. But it's been left far too late. Not enough changes made in January to reinforce the squad in terms of loans or recalls or whatever people wanted. Thomas Frank, in the end, was, I think, a disaster, is a simple way to put it. We've heard about the Arsenal Cup, the constant talking about Arsenal. Arsenal. That's going to be the theme of today. Sorry about that. Like, maybe tune out if you don't want to hear about Arsenal today. His lack of discipline for the players that we heard about, and their lack of respect for him, because he was unable to take on that responsibility, which isn't something he's done before. He had that done for him at Brentford, apparently. It's just been a mess. I found it really interesting that John Bass on the Fighting Cock mentioned how he felt like the no dickheads policy that Frank has is actually more of a way to shield himself from big egos that top clubs have. And I find myself really agreeing with this point of view, especially as we hear that players were turning up to training late after he apparently gave them a talking to. Like, he just didn't have that command of the dressing room. He didn't have that like big personality that we've heard other people talk about and call for. I think Billy T's talked about it a lot across various pods, that Spurs as a football club, and you could say this about Manchester United, you could say it about Chelsea, Arsenal, Real Madrid, whoever, like a demure, more understated character, maybe like Thomas Frank was, isn't necessarily going to be able to sort of impress themselves on these players, on these these superstars who get paid huge wages and know that they'll be here regardless of what happens with a coach. Although in the sort of disaster scenario that we see ourselves facing now, perhaps with relegation, they'll get out, but we'll get onto that. So yeah, I think he deserved to be fired. This is not just me, I think, like I said, 90% of the fan base, you hear that across podcasts. There were missed opportunities. People were pointing to the fact that the players didn't publicly say goodbye. I heard this stated by several people. I'm going to shout out Austin on Stateside Spurs, who put it pretty well. It was two people, Paulinho and Porro, I think, were the only two people who said goodbye to him publicly. Not that they needed to, but I think it says a lot about the state of the squad right now, that the manager can go and there's not even like really that many public facing platitudes. Just the simple stuff, just the thanks boss, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Speaking of American podcasts, friend of the show, Nick, on Wicked Spursy, pointed out how Frank never really connected with the fans. And this was like a recurring theme through Frank's tenure of just an inability to get what Spurs is as a club. And I've heard a few people today floating the idea, and I forget what podcast it was, so apologies, floating the idea of having like I think it was on Last Word on Spurs actually, having somebody like Glenn Hoddle come in as like a director of football philosophy who talks about what it means to be at this club. And Frank never really got that about the fans. He never really connected with us. He never really felt what, not the Tottenham DNA in terms of free-flowing football or whatever, but like who we are, why we do the things we do, why we talk about things the way we do, why we value some of these things. I think Frank just failed to connect with that, and he failed to understand the importance of his words in inspiring a fan base and connecting with the 12th man. Really disappointing. But he's gone, and I'm going to shout out Rosa on Hometown Glory. Great pod if you haven't heard it. Now we find out whether or not everything that's gone wrong this season, and there's a lot. I mean, some that's gone right, but not as much as we'd like. But in the league, the performances, everything else, the losses, the mistakes. Now we find out whether or not it was Thomas Frank's fault or not. And there's been such a heavy emphasis on Frank up to this point as the sort of cause of these issues that I think it'll be really important as a fan base to reflect upon how we talk about the team from here on out. So Frank's gone. Frank shanked. Tudor in, basically. Igor Tudor. There was a bit of a process to get him. It was compressed, but we went through a lot in those, 3 days, 4 days between Frank getting fired and the strong rumours about Tudor coming in popped up. He was definitely a surprise, and this is very much within Johan Langer's style, right? We've seen this before with transfers. We don't hear anything until the last minute. I sort of a click for you there. There were a few options that were discussed. We heard about, Marco Rosa, Terzic, Pochettino on a job share, which, God, that was never going to happen. Pochettino was never ever going to agree to that, and I don't think the USA would either. And obviously Roberto De Zerbi, whose name is also floating around as a potential permanent option in the summer. Of course, every podcaster is talking about Pochettino, for good or for bad, in pro or against Pochettino coming in. But De Zerbi's a name that's floating around in the press, at least, and whether that's just because he's got a good PR, backing, I don't know. He is not without controversy. Obviously, you can look at his time at Brighton and the flare-ups he had with Spurs. The Stellini stuff, not liking comments. He just basically acted like a child. There's obviously more serious stuff in like a more, stepping out of the arena of football. Pointed out by Flav on the Fighting Cock that De Zerbi's defence of Mason Greenwood and what he was accused of, and the things that we heard shared with the press and whatnot, I think the recordings, the text messages were all unacceptable. And there are criticisms out there of podcasters in general, but I think saying that plainly as he did was very welcome about somebody like Roberto De Zerbi, and as a fan base, we shouldn't really accept that type of person coming in and being the focal point and mouthpiece of our club. So Igor Tudor, it sounds like an interesting guy from what we've learned about now, but coming in, no one knew anything about him. There was a few folks who maybe have watched him at Juve or Marseille and had a little bit of an inkling about him, but not many. Many podcasters were pretty upfront about not really knowing anything until he came in and then doing some quick reading. A few pods did have some Italian football experts on. I think OhSoSpurs had somebody on. I want to say an Echo of Glory did too. There's a few people that came on and spoke with a more knowledgeable first-hand experience of seeing what he did at Juve, Udinese, Lazio. All of it just seems like a good logic. James Horncastle, I think, was on a pod talking about that. Might have been the View from the Lane. It's a good logic, but anybody who knows Spurs knows that we can break him. His logic in terms of the turnarounds that he was able to achieve at some of these clubs, it could just be like Jose Mourinho, winning a trophy everywhere he goes. We could break Igor Tudor's record pretty easily. His career as a firefighter, the fires of Spurs could engulf him. Like a lot of chat about him being a championship manager stalwart for a lot of people's teams back in the day. I think it's championship manager 2001, 2002. I vaguely remember playing with him on FIFA, so I can speak to that. But there was a ridiculous number of people who cited his utility as a defensive midfielder and a centre back back in championship manager days from 20 odd years ago. So maybe that says a lot about both the podcaster's football knowledge, but also the age of the average podcaster, especially the ones I listen to. Maybe there were some concerns about his lack of Premier League experience. It's chatted about quite extensively on the Spurs 5. Basically, he's coming into a crisis situation, not knowing the league, not knowing the the speed of the game, the intensity of the game, the tactics that he's up against. He hasn't really had time to plan for this either with, say, a preseason. He's just kind of come straight in. Of course, he's aware of the Premier League because it's the most popular and probably important league in the world, especially from a European perspective. Friend of the show, Gareth Dace, on The Game is About Glory, chatted about how it's ideal to have some Premier League experience coming into the situation we find ourselves in, but it isn't necessary. Is somebody coming in without Premier League experience less valuable than some of the other folks that have been chatted about? Like Robbie Keane was bigged up, and he has not managed outside of the Hungarian First Division. Successful there, but I mean, come on. Harry Redknapp, who hasn't coached a football team in earnest aside from maybe a charity team for 10 plus years. And most managers don't come into the Premier League with experience of the Premier League already. David Harris on Grumpy Old Spurs pointed this out. He also pointed out that Thomas Frank did have Premier League experience. So it's not necessarily quite the gotcha that some people talked about as Igor Tudor maybe not being up to snuff. I did like what Joel said on COYS R Us, that his lack of Premier League experience works both ways. He doesn't necessarily know the other teams as well as another coach might, but that also means that those coaches aren't familiar with his tactics and setup, and that might help us. I'm not sure we saw that in the North London derby, but I can certainly see a logic to it. Of course, all these teams have big scouting departments, and they probably have done their scouting or whatever. A lot of people really glazing Fabio Paratici. He's carried on his affection is carried on. I heard that this is also true of Juventus fans when he came to us, that he was very well liked there. And yeah, it seems like our fans have really put him up on a pedestal as like an ideal director of football. And I'm not sure I agree with that. A lot of people thinking that Tudor was Paratici's choice, and that might be true. There was rumours back in October that he wanted to replace Frank with Tudor, but I do think that Alasdair Gold debunked this, saying that it was led by Langer in the end. So hopefully that's true. Of course, Langer has a whole host of other problems, and I don't think he should be around in the summer, but he probably will be, so c'est la vie. Yeah, so a lot of people are happy about Tudor. There were some expressions of sort of concern, especially after immediately finding out about him being the choice. Vasconi said this on, I think, it would have been Dr. Tottenham. But he warmed up to him, and I think that makes sense. He's very much an unknown quantity. But once you learn about his track record, once you learn about his reported personality, for the situation we find ourselves in needing to turn around a sinking ship. Does that make sense? Rescue a sinking ship? De-sink a sinking ship? Whatever. His track record of doing that almost immediately at some of these clubs, it speaks very highly to the process of choosing him at this point in time. Some people are still not happy with him after letting it sink in. Sonny Snelling said this. Chris on Scarfey Spurs Talk. So it isn't universal acceptance or excitement for Tudor, but I would say that's the sort of majority of fans that I've heard. And of course, some of this is fans just wanting something nice to talk about, something different to talk about that isn't Spurs losing games or Thomas Frank like coming out with an Arsenal hat on or something. Turning it around onto the players real quick, there's been a lot of chatter about the behaviour and mentality of our squad. And I think that this is worth dissecting a little bit more closely as we go along through this podcast, and I want you to have that in the back of your mind. But there's been a real call for these players deserving or needing punishment and or discipline. Kate Mason was on the Spurs show really saying that the dressing room needs this. like there's this sort of idea pervasive through a lot of the fan base that our players are prima donnas. They are not playing for the shirt. They don't want to be at Spurs. They think they're above us. That type of stuff. They're not respecting Frank. They're not turning up to training on time, and from that reason, they need an authoritarian to come in and take over and sort of give them the stick to get them whipped into shape. I do think it's worth remembering that perhaps some of the turnaround and sort of frankness of Tudor that we've heard about can go both ways, right? It can also be really emphasizing the qualities of the players, which is something that Thomas Frank didn't do. And we have heard Tudor say this about the players, that they are good players who have quality. And I think they just need reminding that. Maybe one or two need a kick up the arse, but that's true of any work unit. Sam on the Paxton Tottenham podcast was pointing out that this discipline is going to need to be canny, because one of the tools that a manager has in their toolbox is to drop a player if they are not performing or they're not behaving as professionally as the manager would like. You can't do that with this Spurs team. This Spurs team right now is decimated, and we have very few options. As of recording, yes, some guys like Danso or Porro might be back for Fulham, but like there isn't a ton of options, especially if you look in the forward line. So we'll see how that disciplinary streak comes out, and if it's reported in the press at all, or even after he's gone. I'll be interested to hear how that goes. There's some specific players that people are focusing on. I'll talk about Christian Romero for now. Dan Kilpatrick on The View from the Lane said that Tudor probably won't put up with QT's nonsense. And I'm assuming this is talking about the Instagram posts that Romero has been sharing pretty frequently this season, ever since he took over as captain. And there's something about this, like, love of an authoritarian that speaks to the psyche of many football fans, I feel. The immediate respect for a big, strong, commanding man. There's something there that I don't know, it rubs me up the wrong way. I've talked before about different styles of leadership on this podcast and how you kind of have to respect leaders in different ways of getting a tune out of a team or leading a team softly. Like I talked about Son Heung-min being that type of leader. Getting buy-in from people and their respect that way. And I could understand that there being this idea that, a shouty person coming in, like Tudor is speculated to be, has an immediate jump start. But I don't know. I don't know if that is always the case. I don't know if people just like it as a massive sea change from the public persona of Thomas Frank. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of psychology on, taller men getting jobs and all that type of stuff over shorter people and opportunities. And I think that we're seeing that play out with the hiring of Tudor and the way that people are talking about him. Yeah. So I mean, there's also some stuff about him and his approach to players. He does come in, as I said, was a well-known quantity from Championship manager back in the day. So he has been at big clubs. Juventus is another basket case club, a bit like us. Thanks to Theo Delaney on the Spurs show for pointing that out. I guess so he's used to that kind of pressure. And actually, I listened to an interview on Fuad Cadani's YouTube show with a chap called JFTV. He's a Juve fan, and he compared the Juventus fan base to Spurs, like prior to Tudor being hired, and he felt that they were very similar, like toxic fandom, so some disarray at the club, some players getting sort of turfed out and sidelined. So that's going to be like, I think, a big shot in the arm for us, and some confidence that Tudor probably has the experience to turn this around, at least interpersonally, if not tactically. And honestly, that might be what's more important right now. So People are excited about his front foot style of play. He's reportedly very vertical, likes to get the ball up the pitch quickly, likes to commit with bodies. He's interested in interchangeable positions. Like I've heard that he likes to get his centre backs forward and interchange even with like a number 10 position. So we're going to be sort of cool to see how that plays out, whether or not, at least in the short term, whether Danso takes up the right centre-back position for that reason moving forward. Like, I'd rather have him bounding up the pitch to join in with the attacking play than Radu Dragusin right now. Of course, some people online are calling for Byfield to come in, but I can't see that happening in the short term. There are some complaints that this represents yet another, sea change in the style of play. Ricky Sachs and Mike Lee pointing this out. Like, he is the opposite in many ways of the way that we were playing under Thomas Frank. Very reserved, very concerned about what the other team can do, versus the Antonio stylings of Igor Tudor. That was a reference by Abby Summers on the Inside Spurs Talksport show. She compared him apparently to Antonio Conte and Ange Postecoglou being fused into some horrible chimera. And but yeah, these changes in style of play are a frequent complaint amongst the Spurs fan base. We've seen this over time, and just to rattle off a few changes that we've made over the years, which I think for the most part represent a change from a more defensive viewpoint to a much more free and attacking style under a new manager. You've got Jacques Santini moving on to Martin Jol, Ramos being replaced by Harry Redknapp, AVB to Sherwood. You could make an argument about AVB also being very vertical, but anyway, Sherwood was absolutely much more attacking in his perspective, from my view. Nuno through to Conte, and now Frank being replaced by Igor Tudor. And I think all of these were mid-season changes. So it's very funny that over many different generations of managers, where as a club targeting a more aggressive attacking style when we replace a manager midway through the season. And perhaps it's the sort of heart versus head instincts of our leadership, right? Like, consistently over time thinking that a pragmatic defensive manager is the sort of big club thing to do, versus, oh shit, the fans aren't on board, we better bring in an attacking player to at least like bring them back into this, and maybe they'll buy some season tickets. I don't know. So had a lot of characteristics about Igor Tudor. One of my favorites was the Barnaby on Spurred On pointed out that he was a tough Balkan and that the Croats have seen things. But I'm just gonna go through a list here of the characteristics that I've picked up. I've got like 11 of these or more that I've just jotted down as I was listening to podcasts. People calling him serious, a presence, an authoritarian, a beast, a hard man, a nasty bastard, an assassin, looking like a nightclub doorman. Okay, now it gets weird. Tottenham as Jason Statham. Something from a modern gangster movie. An ex-Special Forces security guard. Again, this is like sort of looping back to the stuff about really focusing in and getting excited about him as a big bloke with a beard and a shaved head, and he likes to wear all black. Like, there's been something that's really piqued the interest of the fan base there. Very weird. He's definitely a motivator. Various football experts, various Italian football experts confirming this across various shows. The Spurs 5 talked a little bit about potential, and a few others, about his ability to possibly connect with the Italian speakers in our squad. Romero, Dragusin, Kulusevski, who's not fit, but part of the squad. And these soft skills are potentially more important than tactics now. I talked about this earlier a little bit, but like, this is being said by Ben Bowman, who is one of the leading tactics voices and analysts within the Spurs fan base. So if he's saying that, I think that's that's going a long way towards sort of, again, validating Igor Tudor as a choice of manager. I'm not saying he is definitely behind him, but that focus on soft skills and player motivation is possibly what's going to dig us out of trouble. There's been such a heavy focus on him as an interim manager, and I know that we know this. He's got a 6-month contract, and Langer came out and said, well, we'll see what happens in the summer. Maybe he'll get brought on if we do the job. There was some bullshit tweet that came out and said if he finishes in the top 10, he'll definitely get the job. I mean, but there's been a pretty strong assumption that he is going to be replaced by Pochettino in the summer. And the way that the Spurs fans are talking about him in that regard is just, it's a little weird, if I'm honest. It's very transactional. And football fandom is very transactional anyway, right? We give you our time and our money and our love, and you give us wins, right? You come here, and when we're done with you, we sell you for money, or we, fire you, right? It's all very inherently transactional. But I can't remember too many times where a coach has come into Spurs and we've all said, well, he's not going to be here forever. Who cares? It's not very often. I think even with loan players, I can't remember there being this type of conversation. Like Timo Werner, when he came in, people saying, well, who cares if he's not the best player in the world? He's only a loanee. That wasn't as a strong a conversation as it has been with Igor Tudor. People saying that we don't need him to last a long time. This was on We Are Tottenham TV. This being an audition, is kind of strange. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being a little nitpicky here. But there's something about it that's made me sort of slightly uncomfortable that we're being so vocal about it, and it does. And I'm going to piss off some people with this. It does make us seem a little entitled, right? There's been a lot of calls for getting behind him and for being supportive of the lads over the next few weeks, but some of the things that have been said about him as a person are sort of really, they're diverse for a start, but they're all diverse in the same way. I don't know if that makes sense. I got a list here. I found 25 different weird ways to describe him. Some really mundane stuff like Mr. Fix-It or firefighter, a short-term mercenary. I mean, this is the type of stuff that I find a little weird. A stopgap, a good screamer, interim emergency manager. The two weirdest ones though were a European or hipster Big Sam Allardyce or a Croatian Sean Dyche. These are the Wolf from Pulp Fiction came up a few times too, and I guess these are fine, and it's just podcasters trying to stay entertaining. But maybe these are people at the end of the day that we're talking about, and discussing him like he's a video game character that we're going to bring in and then discard when we're done with him. It's a little gross. That said, the way I feel right now, I was not really interested in engaging too much, probably because of what I've heard from other podcasters. I was wondering at a certain point, especially the way I felt after Newcastle and the exhaustion after Frank going, as I thought I might never actually hear what he sounds like in an interview, especially if Spurs kept losing games. I would try to distance myself from official content. That was, of course, ruined when I listened to Last Word on Spurs with the clips that they tend to insert into each episode. Sounds like a nice guy. That's anyway. But yeah, but there are some other stuff as well. So I've got some points here. Tom Foynes on Rule the Roost said he doesn't want glitzy interviews. He just needs to do a job, then fuck off in June. Feel how you want to feel. TapinTobs on YouTube, he doesn't care about think pieces on his style. Just get on with it. This is all very transactional and I don't know, disrespectful, I guess is the word I'm reaching for. So on the whole though, the vibes pre-North London derby were pretty hopeful. I mean, I felt that in the room you know, at my local watch party, like, we have been seeing declining numbers over the weeks as Spurs have gotten worse and worse and worse. And I can't blame people for not wanting to take time away from their family to come out on a cold day, drive in the rain or the snow or whatever, and come and spend their money and their time watching Spurs get beat. But we had a pretty good crowd for a North London derby that, by all accounts, we were probably going to lose. Like, pretty good atmosphere. People were enjoying themselves. We went in, and I think that there was hope that we would get something out of the game. And I think this was also validated externally by the journalists. Like Tom Allnut on the Tottenham Way said that there was this feeling of hope amongst the fan base. In some respects, maybe the podcasters that I listened to were very happy just to talk about something new. Ricky on the Fighting Cock said this pretty much. Like, it was nice just to feel hope. And, you know, prior to the North London derby, you don't want to nitpick. You don't want to look for negatives. Like, that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, we've suffered for quite a long time in a weird situation where we all knew that the best choice was to get rid of Thomas Frank. I'll say, we all knew. That's an overstatement. I have seen some people online pushing back against Frank getting sacked. So, with respect to those people, not 100% of the fan base. But it's been a very long time, like possibly going back to October for some people, that they would expect the previous manager to have been sacked. And, you know, there was a lot of conversation. I think I brought this up in my last episode, that Levy would have got rid of him a long time ago. And I totally agree with that. So when you're in that situation where you're expecting something to change, I feel like it does increase the stress and confusion, especially when you get some, you know, sort of crowd effects. What is it called? Like mass delusion stuff that happens, you know, where you get an idea and it percolates through our fan base, and it really just kind of freaks everybody out, and it really raises the tension in everything that we do, and in these losses and in the crowd and spending our money and all that type of stuff. And yeah, I think that because of that, we blamed Frank so intensely and so strongly that any change would have been welcome. Like, a lot of people were expecting Johnny Heitinger to take over. And I think people would have been happy that a change was made. Maybe not quite so much as Igor Tudor coming in, but they're certainly very welcoming of all of this. And not everybody was so positive. Rob White on One Cyril did refer to this change in status of the fan base as being more like champagne pessimism than actually hope. But a lot of folks before the North London derby were expecting him to get something out of Randall Kolo Muani, sort of being the RKM whisperer, due to their relationship at Juventus. And this was even amongst folks who are not particularly known for their wishful thinking, like Milo on The Game Is About Glory. He's not one for like projecting that type of thing onto a player, but it actually came true. We saw him get, you know, a goal and a half on Sunday. His form has been awful in the Premier League, but all things considered, I think he probably had a good game. Shout out to Billy T on the Spurs related podcast, who did predict that Randall Kolo Muani would score 2 goals before the North London derby. I do think he was our best player in the North London derby, quite frankly. A few other people felt this too. Other people said Xavi, but I thought he did pretty right. I thought he did pretty all right. A lot of people, a lot of the podcasters were talking about how this was essentially a free hit. So it didn't really matter what happened in the North London derby because Tudor hasn't had a lot of time in situ, and Arsenal are, you know, top of the league, and we're on a really bad run of form, and we're injured, and it's more about the performance and that type of thing. So I actually counted up how many podcasts said that it was a free hit or a free pass or something similar. So out of the sort of, I think it was like 30 odd podcasts that I checked the transcripts for, and 40% of them said that this was a free hit. And I just want you to have that in the back of your mind, the sort of concept of the North London derby being a derby game and us wanting to do well and needing to get points out of it if we could, but this being about embedding a play style or showing some fight or a performance or something, right? And some of these podcasts that I'm not going to name them because I don't want to call them out, but they're very big podcasts with large fan bases that, you know, really set the tone for what the fan base should expect out of the North London derby. And honestly, although I said it's 40% of the pods that I checked said this explicitly, I would say that a vast majority of the ones that didn't mention quote unquote a free hit said something to the effect of, like, they said something very similar, that it was about the performance. It wasn't, you can't expect too much out of the game. So yeah, that's that really caught my ear as I went into the North London derby, and honestly is part of the reason why I didn't put this podcast out sooner, because I wanted to come back to that idea and see if people really followed up on it, whether they really walked the talk on it. The atmosphere in the crowd sounds great. Jay on View from the Lane, Ricky on The Fighting Cock, Billy T, Vass on Dr. Tottenham were saying it was tremendous compared to previous games. There was a real buzz in the air. There was talk about the buzz in the pubs before the game. And yeah, like Seb said on Only Tottenham, like, what's the point if you can't get up for a North London derby? You've got to rise yourself up, and I think that's makes a lot of sense. And it's pretty funny because all of this hope, against top of the table Arsenal, who've had their boot on our throat earlier in the season, and we're still talking about whether we can poke them in the eye, if we can take points off them. It really sums up the dreamer nature of Spurs fans and the hopefulness that we have in our core. I think that even when the chips are down, we're still thinking that we can do something. It's really cool. That's what I love about us. Now let's move on to after the North London derby. You're living in it now. It's rancid. It's very, very angry. Sadly, I couldn't listen to quite as many pods as the pre-North London derby analysis I did. I was like 30-odd podcasts that and shows that I managed to hit for the Tudor hiring and the North London derby previews. And I don't really want to talk about Arsenal's qualities too much here. We all know they're very good, and we all know that we're very shit. So we're just going to focus on the fan reaction. Some of the phrases that really stuck out to me was, Danny Kelly on View from the Lane calling it, I think, disgraceful. Marcus Buckland on Last Word on Spurs called it a shocker. Yes, there was a lot of chances that we gave up. Andy on Dr. Tottenham talks about this. But I don't agree that it was a shocking performance. I think that maybe it was a lot similar. I do agree that it was a little bit more similar to what we saw under Thomas Frank that many were expecting. But after 5 days on the training pitch with Igor Tudor, it's probably not that surprising. And honestly, the first half for me was pretty decent. I mean, we came out of it 1-1. There was good energy. There was maybe a few too many Arsenal chances that, especially in the first 10 minutes or so, that I would have liked. There were mistakes happening, but like, this has been the season. It's not going to suddenly be where world beaters. And moving to the second half, yeah, we went a goal down. We got back into it through another great goal from Randall Kolo Muani that absolutely should have stood. And there's an awful lot of conspiracy theorizing about biases and all that type of stuff from the Spurs fan base, and I can't blame them. Like, the Arsenal defender totally dove. But, we should have technically got ourselves back into it, and you don't know what happens then. Go 3-1 down. Charleston gets a goal, saved off the line by Raya. Like, we did pretty well with the chances that we had to get ourselves back into the game, and it's just one of those things where you see teams at the bottom of the table just get fuck all luck, and it's super frustrating. And I wonder how much of that has contributed to this anger at the team, that when we did have chances, we almost got it over the line. So maybe if we performed a little bit better and had a few more chances, maybe we could have done better in that game. I don't know. Yeah, it was miserable. It was a miserable experience. I think that I was sad more than anything else. I was angry after the North London derby back in October, September time, whenever it was. Like that was a shit show at the start of the season with pretty much a full squad. This felt like just a confirmation of how bad we are and the distance between us and them lot. Some existential crises from a few podcasters. Flav on The Fighting Cock and Jack on Rule the Roost, both questioning what Spurs fans have done in their lives to be treated like this. I don't know whether that's because they're mates in that same sort of, probably in the same WhatsApp groups, and there's a bit of a hive mind going on, or whether this is true of other football fans or it's just a type of humor or whatever. But it stood out to me. People recontextualizing the idea that that Arsenal were wobbling. They did have that Wolves draw a couple of days before they played us. People calling out that was a bit of a narrative that we bought into. Perhaps we convinced ourselves of something that was never going to happen. Some complaints about the pressing from the team, some energy levels. Franco in the cheese room criticizing this, which is notable because Tudor demands running, apparently. But I mean, I don't know how you can say that of any modern coach. Are there any coaches who don't do a lot of running? So just it was rough. It was a rough time, and I'm a little annoyed that across the board, and I didn't follow up on an individual sort of basis, that this idea of a free hit was purely speculative, or it just didn't materialize. People didn't give Tudor the grace that they were claiming that they would do before the game. And I don't know whether that's because the game was much poorer than they felt, or there was not living up to expectations in terms of getting a draw or even a win out of the game. I don't know. It was a weird one. And it's just worth, holding people accountable to that sometimes. Something notable that happened in terms of the Frank era criticisms that I picked up on versus what we're experiencing now is a much more intense focus on player performances. Now that Thomas Frank isn't here to be the fall guy for the team, people are starting to turn on the players a little more aggressively, I think, and especially in the wake of an Arsenal loss. And I referenced this earlier, that there's this idea that the players are above their station and they are believing they're above Spurs. This was mentioned by Cal on The Fighting Cock. I don't often agree with Cal, but there have been some things and relationships between the players that have broken down this season that would suggest that this is perhaps true. Pedro Porro has directly criticized the fans in Instagram posts, and there is a responsibility on their shoulders to win the games. We can't get out there and kick the ball. And this criticism is really annoying. Martin Cloak on Last Word on Spurs, Martin's a huge advocate of Spurs fans, really pushed back on this and pointing out this responsibility to perform. There's an idea that the team gave up versus Arsenal. Nathan A. Clark and Bardi debated this on The Extra Inch. I'm not really convinced that they gave up. I think that there was a bit of a physicality problem, especially with the drop-off in quality that we had in the second half and the options that we had. I think that was just kind of the players losing a bit of gas against a really, really technically excellent Arsenal team. Players aren't good enough. Just hearing that across the board. Certain players, however, were lightning rods for some of the anger of the podcasters. Dragusin is the most obvious one. He took a lot of stick for his performance, especially in the second half. I thought in the first half he was okay. There was that weird run out of the back that he did where he, almost like he kind of forgot what was happening. There's been some people pointing out that he shouldn't be doing this, obviously, and that for that reason he shouldn't be played in the centre of the park. I will come back to what I said earlier, which is my understanding of Tudor's system is that he likes to get his centre-backs forward, and you've got to question yourself whether you want that to be Radu, Dragusin, or Romero/Danso. Pick your poison there. And Radu's kind of an interesting case because he's really not back too long from a major knee injury. Is it ACL and a knee? whatever. He's just come back from a major ACL injury. And as we've seen with like Rodrigo Bentancur, it can take time for them to get anywhere near first team quality. So whilst I don't think Radu Dragusin is the best defender in the world, I think it's worth remembering that he's got some shit going on himself. And in an ideal world, he wouldn't be thrown into the first team against Arsenal so quickly. Come back to Romero getting a nonsense red card against Manchester United. Another player that's received some criticism is Mickey van der Ven. Love Mickey, got his name on the back of a shirt this season. And mainly people have been focusing a lot on his body language. It really is quite reminiscent of the Jan Vertonghen stuff from a while back. And you can hear this in some of the podcasters pointing it out, that it's reminiscent of that time and how what clearly wasn't true of Jan, who obviously still loves us, came back recently. There was this 5-second clip that did the rounds that a lot of podcasters talked about, and even after it was somewhat debunked or questioned whether or not Tudor was pointing and shouting at Van der Ven to move up, or whether he was shouting at Dragusin, and that Mickey's face was either annoyance at being told what to do, or whether it was confusion about why Dragusin wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. Regardless, there was this assumption of the worst about Mickey that happened. It's very difficult from that clip, at that angle, to figure out what was happening. And like I said, there were two pretty equally valid viewpoints, I think, of what was happening in the clip. And it all comes back to as well that you've got to remember that Mickey van der Ven is a professional footballer doing his job, and is, I think at the time, were we losing? Like, of course he's not going to look the happiest bunny in the world. It's very difficult to figure out what happened in a 5-second clip, and points to Bardi for pointing this out on the extra inch. Something that I found funny was that there was a lot of criticism directly or guardedly against the person who took the video, which I guess it's out there. It's Chris Cowlin takes a lot of videos at the games and shares them on social media. That people were claiming that he only takes videos of negative stuff. It seems to be inflammatory for clicks, that type of thing. I'll leave that there. I don't know intent. But yeah, I mean, people have turned a lot against Mickey this season. I think some of his arguments with the fans has done that. The Gary Neville interview has been talked about as very similar to Harry Kane's interview. His body language sucks, according to some people. The tough part is, right now, I mean, my body language would suck too, because Spurs are shit. If I was out on the pitch, I have difficulty distancing the player as a person from the player as a professional on the field. And I don't know, I feel somewhat uncomfortable with being a body psychology analysis person. And I'm a little uncomfortable with being a psychologist from a distance. And yeah, this comes back to as well the disciplinarian perception of Tudor and people calling for these players to be whipped into shape. Xavi was another person who received some criticism. There was talk about his physical duels. He tried a lot and so basically didn't execute a ton of them. Some people think we overpaid for him. Some people questioning whether he was fit enough, how good he was. I felt bad because I was sat there watching him and I'm thinking to myself, well, the problem with Xavi in this system, the way that we're playing him, is that we're asking him to do a lot. Or at the very least, he's asking a lot of himself. But he doesn't have the 10 out of 10 tools across the board to get himself out of trouble with 3 people on him. He hasn't got the strength to fight off 3 dudes like Gareth Bale used to, or the pace like he used to, or I think even the touch in some regards to get himself out of trouble with 3 huge Arsenal players bearing down on him. But he's trying stuff, and I think that's to be commended, and that's pointed out by some people like Jim on OhSoSpurs, saying that he was probably our best player, let down by his teammates. But he is getting better on the whole. That seems to be the vibe on Xavi. he's probably harshly criticised because he's the player who we expect to carry us. And a lot of people want that type of player. They point to us in the past having a Sheringham or a Ginola or a Kane or somebody, Klinsmann, somebody who can dig us out of trouble, and Xavi's probably the closest we have to that. Just kind of more of the same. That was the criticism across the board. It wasn't enough of a sea changer. Some questions about player mentality. I'll try and skip through these a little bit more quickly. Citing evidence that players are slower to come back from the team is performing badly. This was shared by Theo Delaney on the Spurs show. That's interesting. I would like to see the data on that. Some real heavy-handed criticism of Dom Solanke, who missed starting the game because he had a throat problem which required treatment with antibiotics. A lot of people making fun of him for that. Ricky Sachs, Billy T, a few others sort of questioning why. Like it's only a sore throat. If he needed antibiotics, I can tell you from personal experience that I'm assuming it was something like strep throat. That stuff can knock you on your ass. That wipes you of your energy. It's fevers, stuff like that. Like, do we really want a half-fit player starting at the North London derby? He came on, he did 30 minutes. I think that's pretty good. Would I like him starting? Yeah, of course I would. Randall Kolo-Muani did a more than serviceable job up top. But it's this transactional nature of football fandom where we expect these guys, because they're paid a lot of money, to not have human bodies at times that get sick. We saw this with Christian Romero recently. He had to come off at halftime. Would that be a good way to approach the game plan? I would rather that Tudor went in knowing that Solanke was a closer rather than hoping that he's got the legs to go 60 minutes, 70 minutes. It's just asking a lot of a guy who's just come back from injury, and honestly, don't need to risk him in this game if it's such a free hit. Seb on Only Tottenham as well, questioning whether or not these players are worried about getting injured before the World Cup and getting a move that way. And there's been a few people chatting about whether or not their players are looking at relegation the same way that we do. It's not maybe as professionally as embarrassing as it should be, and actually it's almost like an escape door out of the mess that is Tottenham right now. And I don't agree with the sentiment, but I'm also not in these players' heads. Maybe a few of them are, I don't know. But I can't believe that it would mean they can command the money that they would ask for, or the choice of teams to play for. If you're performing so badly that you're in a relegation team, you're not going to get a move to Real Madrid, are you? Yeah, so it's been a bit of a weird one. I got a lot more points here, but I see them coming up on an hour. It really wasn't a free hit after all. There are no free hits from this point onwards. Maybe I misinterpreted the situation. Maybe I misinterpreted what these people were saying. But yeah, it was amongst the worst group of podcasts that I've probably listened to ever. Not just in the time of running Poddenham Podspur, but I've been listening to Spurs pods for a while now, probably 15 years. This was really bleak. There was barely anything positive said, especially in the immediate wake of the game. It got a little better throughout the week, probably as people were looking towards the Fulham game and hearing about players coming back. But God, it was rough, especially for those players, especially for those podcasters who were in the stadium, right? I'd be interested to know whether there was a difference between the match-going podcasters versus those who were remote. I suspect it isn't a huge difference, but a more nuanced sentiment analysis could be cool. And I'm also kind of interested in how these podcasts really influence the feeling and emotions amongst the fan base. I talked about establishing the game as a free hit before and then pulling that rug out afterwards. I do wonder how this affects, people who were in the stadium especially, and their ability to get behind the team, and what influence a podcast might have, especially the highly listened to ones. They get tens of thousands of listeners, not millions, don't get me wrong, but there's so many podcasts and there's so much alignment on some some reactions to games that I can't help but feel that they must have some kind of influence on the fan base and how we perceive and react to games. And now I'm not saying that people shouldn't feel bad about losing a North London derby, but I think context here is really important to remember. We had a new coach, a lot of injuries, and just a massive difference in quality. And we don't know what's going to come next, and that's the important thing to look forward to, is that there's still uncertainty about what the rest of the season looks like, but I think it's a lot more hopeful with Tudor in charge rather than Thomas Frank. A lot of it's going to depend on how and when the players come back, whether their confidence comes back too. Maybe some confidence in the fan base as well. I mean, I do dread what the mood will be amongst the supporter base if we don't win against Fulham. I think even a draw, we might hear some real toxic stuff being shared. And there's still 10 games after that. There's a lot of talk about how many points we need. Some people are predicting like 4 wins. Martin Lipton on the Whistle Blows shared this with Connor and Billy on there. What's that, 12 points? 4 wins? I don't know. I'm hoping it'll be less than that. We just got to match what West Ham do, essentially. But I don't really want to cover the relegation talk until it's a real thing. Like, up until then, it feels like contributing to some of the malaise of the fan base. I've probably done that a bit today with my dour voice, but I don't want to waste my time. I don't think we're going to get relegated. I don't think we're that bad. Not that we're too good to go down or too big or anything. I think there's some quality in the team still, and I have to be hopeful. I mean, this episode would be 5 hours long if I had to talk about all the relegation talk that's been shared, and I'd probably walk into the woods afterwards. If you are interested in the last time that Spurs got relegated back in the 70s, there was a fair bit of chatter about it on Last Word on Spurs and the Spurs show. So I'd recommend those to people who want to hear some first-hand accounts of how that went down and the differences between then and now. I think Jim also had a short video on OhSoSpurs, I think on YouTube. It was like 8 minutes long, talking about the relegation stuff too. There was a brief bit in there about finances, stuff like that. But I'm sure as we get closer to that horrible day, if it ever comes, there'll be plenty of podcasts to cover. Some folks are still positive. You should be too, because what's the point otherwise? Things might get better. Carl on the Spurs show, Windy on the Extra Inch, they think this. They think this. I think this too. Yeah. I mean, it is what it is. We're stuck in a really bad situation. It's not fun. But on the plus side, it could get really fun. Well, that's your ending. A bit of a rambly one today. Probably I gave myself too much to cover. Thanks for listening. Share the pod and like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And thanks for your time. I appreciate all of you, the hundreds of you who tune in weekly to listen to me ramble on about Spurs podcasts. It still kind of blows my mind that that's a thing, but you're all great. And keep listening to Spurs podcast and keep making Spurs podcasts. Up the Spurs, always.